everybody, Matthew here from MiniWarGaming.com, and welcome to another episode of the Wargaming Gamemaster. Now, just before we get started, if you are listening to this or watching this, I apologize if there's a bit of artifacting with the sound. We kind of whipped this episode together really fast. I wanted to get Miles here, which I'll introduce him in a second. His name is Miles, but I'll introduce him more in a second, to participate via Skype. But Miles, you're all the way from, I want to say Netherlands, and I'm going to get it wrong. Netherlands, right? Yes, yep. I got it right. And so there's some artifacting with that. Now, if there's not any artifacting, well, then Colin is a audio engineer wizard, and he managed to get rid of it. But I'm still going to preface it because one of the things I wanted for the show is like really good audio. But when you Skype people in, sometimes, you don't always have control over that. So we're just going to do the best we can. So hopefully it doesn't bother you too much throughout this episode. So I got Miles Drake here. And he's going to be joining me for today's episode because it's very suiting based on the question that we will be answering. Miles, give us the 15-second version of who you are.
Well, I'm a writer based in Amsterdam for the most part. I'm actually American, but yeah, I write for the Black Library. I've done 2 published short stories right now. Got 3 more in the works that should be published at some point. I don't know how the publication process works. And of course,
it'll be published when it's published.
Yeah. And yeah, of course, I do some of the narrative campaigns for MiniWarGaming.
That's right. So I can't remember how long ago you started. How long ago did you start writing narrative campaigns for us?
The original Watchers in Death. I jumped in about halfway through.
And that was how long ago?
Ooh. July, maybe?
Is that it? It feels like it's been longer. I believe you. It just feels like it's been longer.
The last July. Over a year.
Oh, you mean like July of 2018?
Yeah.
Okay, that sounds right. Because I'm like, July's only like 3 months ago.
No.
It's definitely been longer than that. That's right. Yeah. And you've written, that's right, because at one point, I'm trying to remember what sparked the conversation to actually get a writer. I think I was overwhelmed. We had so much to get done, and the writing aspect of the narrative campaigns that we do was very time-consuming. And so I thought, wouldn't it be nice to be able to hire a writer? And we put a call out, and you sent me an email saying, how would you like a Black Library writer or author writing your stuff? And I'm like, hey, you got my attention.
I did preface that by saying, I'm not Dan Abnett or anything. just a small writer.
That's right. But still, it's fun. It's fun, and that's worked out really well. So yeah, so Miles has been writing for us for over a year, doing various narrative campaigns. Not every narrative campaign since then, but most of the narrative campaign stories that you hear were written by him. Still produced by MiniWarGaming, meaning that we work together to come up with the story. And then Miles does all the legwork of getting that done. Even writing some of the scenarios, even if we modify them afterwards, a lot of the scenarios started off as Miles's idea, and then maybe we modify them after that to fit them into what we're trying to accomplish. So we'll come back to Miles in just a couple minutes. Quick announcements. Over the past week, there's been a couple new things that have come out. A new Age of Sigmar narrative campaign called the Dragontooth Labyrinth. Miles did not write this one. It was like one of the first in a while that I didn't have him write. And the reason for that is because I wanted to do something that was a little more simple in terms of the story. And honestly, I had the idea for it like on a Thursday, and we started filming it the Monday. So there wasn't much time for much writing, and it wasn't meant to be a super story-heavy one. Although there is a lot of story to it, it's more the story of what happens in the battle reports. Whereas our typical narrative campaigns, there's a lot of story, and then the battle reports affect the story. Whereas in this one, the battle reports were 90% of the story. So it's the tale of the Bloody Crusade led by Vladislav the Impaler of Khorne, Mortal Khorne, as he, played by Luca, which is why the names are the way they are, as they delve deep into a storm vault, a grand storm vault left by Sigmar at the edge of Realm of Gur, the Realm of Beasts. And I had so much fun filming it. We'd filmed the whole thing in 2 weeks. And that's going to come out for the next 5 weeks. So it started last Saturday. So go check that out. Also, my new, I know I talked about this Battle Report series, but it actually started coming out. Nothing but narrative. The first couple episodes have gone up. The next couple episodes will be going up soon. There are no dice battle reports, and you'll see those are like 10 minutes long each. You'll have to give me your feedback. So go check those out and give me your feedback. Finally, I had mentioned that as I do reviews of the various scenarios of the different books, I would actually make a living document on MiniWarGaming to show you those reviews, and I've done that. So if you go to miniwargaming.com, you click on Tools and Rules, you'll see the Wargaming Gamemaster reviews. That's a menu item. You click on that, and you'll see the ones that I've reviewed so far. And I give them a rating of number of Dancing Matthews, the maximum being 5 Dancing Matthews. And so far, none of them have gotten 5 Dancing Matthews, because if I have to make changes, it's not 5 Dancing Matthews. Not to say that they're not good scenarios, but I don't just put the number of Dancing Matthews they get. It also like talks about how I liked it and what I would change for each of them as well. So there's a few in there, and I plan on updating that document as I play more scenarios. And sometimes I'll review them. I'll just put them in the document. I won't even talk about them on the show because I won't have time. And other times I'll talk about on the show, and then I'll put it in the document. So just, take a look whenever you want, and it gives you ideas of which ones I like. That's all the announcements. So Miles is here to help me today because I read an email last week by Cliff Trett, and we didn't have time to talk about it on our last episode because we ended up talking too much about the other stuff that we wanted to. So we're going to make an entire episode around your email, Cliff. That's how much we appreciate it. And if you would like to submit questions or topic ideas, you can do so just by leaving a comment here if you're watching this on YouTube or on Facebook. If you're watching like on a podcast where there's no place to leave a comment, feel free to email me, Matthew@miniwargaming.com. That's Matthew with 2 T's, the way it's meant to be spelled. And I probably won't reply to your email, but I promise I will read every single one of them. Because I get too many emails to be able to reply to all of them and to reply every comment. But I do read every single comment and every single email that comes in. I can promise that. Unless it goes to my spam folder. Nothing I can do about that, really. Well, not much I can do about that. So here is the email. I will read it again. And if you hear yelling in the background, that's because there's battle reports going on, because that is what we do here. To start, I love MiniWarGaming for years, and I am a lifetime Vault member, which is awesome. Thank you, Cliff. I love your narrative campaigns, as they are the main reason I purchased the lifetime Vault membership. So I have questions, either to you directly or for your show for discussion. Myself and 2, maybe 3 friends want to do a closed narrative campaign. We'll start off with 500-point skirmish, end up doing 2,500 to 3,000-point battles against each other. How do you plan the start of a story? Like, how do you come up with a setting? How do they meet? What are the goals? Are they set in stone? Then once each battle is completed, how do you, as the games master, mold the narrative story in a good way that the next battles aren't 100% one-sided? That would wipe out the opposition. And he said, finally, as an example, the angel and the serpent narrative was a great idea, but it didn't feel very narrative, whereas all the Death Watch felt like a brilliant narrative game. How can you make something like angel and serpent feel more narrative? Now, that one I'm not as familiar with, so did you help write that one, Miles?
Yeah. I basically wrote one up, but so the...
Now, there was a lot of narrative, just to be clear, it's not that there wasn't a lot of narrative agents of the Serpent. There was a ton, because there was the storytellers beforehand. So I'm not exactly sure what he's referring to as it feeling less narrative. Maybe were the battles not as effective?
It's more so basically I wrote all 4 of those prior to any of them being filmed. So there was no film 2 and then I will adjust the narrative later on to accommodate for those, or film 1 then adjust the that way. So it was very
fair. That's a very fair point, that it wouldn't feel like the battle reports were affecting the story as much.
No, so I kind of had to work with how to make it sort of carry on, each individual battle, how it might have a semi-meaningful impact. But of course, as the question put forth, you don't want to have a impact from the first battle be too meaningful that it completely skews everything out of whack.
Exactly. Well, that's, it's an interesting thing. That's a different way to do it. It's not right or wrong. It's just a different way to do it. When you look at the books that like Games Workshop publishes, for example, with campaigns, obviously those are all pre-written. The history's already happened, and they give you the scenarios to replay. There's fun in that. I'm not as big a fan of doing that. I feel it's more like that's more like historical wargaming. I feel like, well, that's already happened. Why would I reenact that? With certain exceptions. But that is still a type of narrative campaign where you're playing through something that's already happened, or maybe your battles are just like, we're going to play this story. And I know our battles won't necessarily affect the story, but we can still determine a winner based off of what happens in the battles. So it just depends on how deep you want to go. So we got a bunch of questions in here, all related to story. So let's start, and let's talk about how to plan the start of a story. So I'll turn it over to you, Miles, for a minute or two. Why don't you start? What are your thoughts if somebody's starting their own homebrewed narrative campaign at home with a few of their friends? How can they decide on what the story is going to be and the setting, all that kind of stuff?
Basically, so if you're doing a homebrew thing, and I think you touched up on this in the first episode of this series, is setting-wise, work with what you have. If you have a game table that is a jungle forest table and that's all you've got, don't set it on a city planet because you don't have the terrain for it. Unless you're a big studio and you happen to have a lot of terrain lying around, you're kind of already deciding the setting based on that. However, that's just one part of the setting. That's just kind of the aesthetics of the planet you're on. What the actual planet is, or if it's Age of Sigmar, for example, that can be entirely irrelevant to the actual aesthetics. I'd say the next point that you'd want to address is who is involved. By who, I mean what factions. And that's already going to color the campaign quite a bit. If this is an Astra Militarum versus Gene Stealer cults campaign, if these are the two factions you want to have involved, then you're already kind of looking at, okay, so there's probably going to be some sort of rebellion going on, some sort of, Gene Stealer cult insurrection, Gene Stealers doing Gene Stealery things. And whereas if you're working with, if you're working with two factions that might not have as much of a direct cause to go to war with each other, then you kind of have to figure out an idea, like what is the motivation here? Why would the Tyranids be fighting the Necrons, for example? And in those circumstances, you kind of might want to put your heads together with the people that you're going to be doing the narrative campaign with, and sort of decide on like what type of story do we want? Do we want some sort of like large scale war? Do we want something that starts off smaller, maybe a couple of scouting parties run into each other and you have this gradual escalation going on? Are they fighting over something? Is there an artifact involved? I guess with the Tyranids example, that's probably not going to be relevant. So
maybe usually you never know, right? You can usually find a way to include almost anything in any narrative campaign if you really want to.
Yeah, that's true, and that can of course be another point. Like, if you really want to include something, there's ways to do it. Like you can include almost any objective with any faction, providing you can think up a good enough reason for it. But with some factions, it's just kind of like some factions against each other. It's easier, if like anything involving the Gene Stealer cults, it's probably going to be an uprising of some kind.
Those stories almost write themselves. Like they
exactly.
infiltrate, they sneak in, they rebel, they try to disrupt, and then the Tyranids arrive, maybe, or maybe
escalates.
Yeah, exactly.
Good infestation. Anybody? Yeah.
No, those are really good points there, because I like to do that too. I like to we do have a lot of terrain here, and we do have a lot of models to pick from, and yet I still like to kind of walk around and look at it and see what inspires me. And then on top of that, see, in the office, the way that we start a new narrative campaign is I'll sometimes get an idea from a book or from a campaign supplement, and I'll be like, oh, that sounds like a fun story that I would want to play. So rarely do we just come up with stories like just from nowhere. It's more like, I remember the Storms of Ixia campaign. I had just read the Gaunt's Ghost book, and I'm like, oh, I actually do want to do an Astra Militarum campaign. Who knew? I thought they were boring. And then I read that book, and I'm like, this is so cool. And that gave me the motivation, some ideas for an Astra Militarum campaign. And and reading the lore of the Gene Stealer cults, of course, makes you really want to do that too. But you then the next step that I do, once I have an idea, is I walk out into the office where everybody else is, and I start to talk about this idea, and I see who gets the most excited. And that's usually the person I'll pick to do the campaign with. And then I try to give them as many options as I can, because I want them to invest. I have found that the campaigns where I force things on them, I'm like, here's your team, play with them. They don't get nearly as involved as build your team, or pick the army you want to do. Like with Luca, for example, for the Dragontooth Labyrinth, what I did is I walked up and I said, okay, I'm going to do it with you because out of everybody, that just seemed to be the most available and the most excited. And not that the other ones weren't excited for it, but just the most excited. And I said, so what I want you to do is I want you to choose 2 factions. Like, for example, Stormcast Eternals and Sylvaneth. Or Dispossessed at Carriage on Overlords. Or I'm like, but don't do that one because we're going underground a lot. So the Carriage on Overlords won't make much sense. But still, something like that. And then what we're going to do is we're going to build a 4,000 point-ish band. And then I'm going to give you 2 missions at a time. And you're going to choose who's going on each mission. So you have to split your forces, essentially. So it forces you to use different things. And then he's like, I want to do corn. I'm like, okay, and? He's like, just corn. That's what I want to do. And I'm like, all right. I guess it's corn. Not exactly good, guys, but he just kind of embraced that. And because it was Luca, and because the new Auric book had just come out, I wanted to bring back Hamathroa, who was from a previous campaign that beat the crap out of Luca. He was just a side character that ended up being a lot of fun. So it's very organic, I guess is what I'm trying to say. And if you're with your friends, yeah, you got to follow Miles' advice there. Look at the terrain that you have. Look at the armies that you have. That's your start. And maybe it's okay sometimes to be like, hey, I just read this book and I really want to do Astra Militarum. Nobody has it, but I'm so excited I'm going to build an Astra Militarum army. The second narrative campaign we ever did, second, I want to say? Yeah, I think it was the second. Steve built a 4,000 point Eldar army for it within like a month or 2. And that was awesome. And so that can happen. And we've built terrain specifically for narrative campaigns, but that's unusual. That's not the norm. The norm is that we take stuff that we already have and we build campaigns out of that. So starting there is definitely it. I'd say the biggest thing is just if you're kind of invest yourself into the lore, and as you read more of the lore, that can pop up ideas as well.
Yeah, indeed. If you end up inspired by something that you read and that's where you want to go, then why not, right?
Yeah, exactly.
You're going to have the most fun doing what inspires you the most, not what maybe is the most convenient.
And if I could just go one piece of advice too, if you as the games master want to do this, you present it to your friends, and if they're not super excited about it, come up with a different idea. Because campaigns take a lot of energy to do and to finish. And if they're only kind of interested at first, I can tell you that a few games in, the energy is going to be gone, and it's just going to be work. And you guys have no reason to make it work. Like, we have a reason to make it work because it's our jobs. Therefore, it is work. But if for you guys, like if something becomes stale, you stop doing it, right? And you don't want to get to that situation. So try to find something that immediately everybody's like, oh, yeah, that sounds awesome. If they're not saying, oh, yeah, that sounds awesome, they're probably not enthusiastic enough. And you should try to find a different idea. So, Of course, here we have a bit of a different experience, because what usually happens for us is that I get on a Skype call with Miles, and I tell him my ideas, and I give him a ton of creative license, but within a certain context of an idea that I have. And so how do you so let's talk about that. Let's say that you are already given some sort of context to work within, maybe something that all the players are excited for. So how do you, Miles, then take that and within the confines of what you know we want you to do, develop a story from that? And you can give examples from any narrative campaign that you've done with us or whatever you want to do. Yeah,
so basically, going to try and avoid any major spoilers here, but the Shattered Imperium campaign, just, going with the latest one that came to mind. Matthew came up to me and was like, yeah, I want to move the story of the Imperium along. And I was like, okay, that sounds pretty awesome. Like, that's always something I've been toying with. And, he gave me a couple of ideas of, like, what do you want to have happen? Or more like what he wanted to have happen. And then basically I was just able to work out the different factions that were going to be involved, which these were, of course, going to be remnants of factions that already exist that have, split into many pieces, all that type of stuff, building the framework for this kind of larger scale setting. And of course, when you're working with a narrative campaign, it doesn't have to be nearly on that scale. And ultimately, the Shattered Imperium campaign isn't on that scale. That's just building the backdrop. In fact, the scale is basically following around Inquisitor Rin on his nefarious adventures. And basically, the idea I had is, in that case, how do I best showcase this new universe that we've created? How do I introduce all of these factions? And of course, as it's gone, you don't want to dump everybody in head first. You kind of want to give this trickle down information, feed them little bit by little bit. No exposition overloads. That's nobody really likes that. So yeah, it's just this kind of slow process of working with the information you have and then kind of molding it in a way that the players will receive it in a, I guess, a gradual manner. And from there, it's about building the scenarios to kind of work around that and working with the characters that you have.
A little question just to jump in there. Because one of the things he asks in here is like, how do you determine the goals, and then how do you mold it as the games go on so that the goals are met, but you don't want one side to be at such an advantage over the other side that, because he's speaking, it looks like the kind of campaign that you're talking about, Cliff, is one where there isn't really a GM, where it's more like there's a few of you that want to play and you're trying to come up with a rule set and the setting. Because when it's a GM, you don't have to worry about one side getting the upper hand. You're the GM. You just make things up as you go along. And so you let them get as powerful as you want, because you can always match that power on the other side, because you can just make things up. You can be like, more forces show up for this one, or this particular faction shows up for this one. So it sounds like he's trying to do something more closed without a GM.
Yeah.
So how do you create a story and then mold that story so people feel like it's progressing and yet it's still playable?
Basically, so what I would do there, if you're running a more versus style narrative campaign, if you have multiple people going up against each other, maybe there is a GM that is sort of guiding it along and making sure that nothing gets too out of hand on one side or another. You can have each scenario have some form of... It doesn't have to be a long-term consequence. It can be an immediate consequence that only is going to affect the next scenario. Say one side wins. Say there's some sort of situation where an Astra Militarum force is attempting to hold a pass from a encroaching Chaos Warband, for example. If they lose, obviously this is going to affect the next scenario. They'll be pushed back from this pass, and the Chaos forces will get some sort of advantage in the next scenario. However, it doesn't have to be like, and now all of a sudden the Chaos Forces get this advantage, which is going to remain so for the rest of the campaign. You don't have to do this whole, I'm going to upgrade units based on who wins, because then, you're going to run into this snowballing effect. But if you can still do that to some degree, but then it's almost better to have units upgrade on both sides, the ones that do well on both sides, rather than just, the winning side gets to pick units to upgrade. But that's another topic. Basically, this would be more, work with short-term benefits that can't snowball because they're only going to affect the next scenario, or maybe only two scenarios down, or maybe you even have a benefit that one side can get that won't immediately affect things, but might affect things further down the line. You just have to kind of, be creative about it. And
I think the other thing too is, especially if there's a GM involved, make sure that the battle reports do have a significant impact on the story. And if there's a certain thing that you want to have happen in the story, make sure that that happens not in the battle report. Like I've always said, if you don't want a character to die, he doesn't show up in the battle report. Now, we kind of took some chances with Inquisitor Rin showing up in a few battle reports in the Shattered Imperium because I didn't want him to die, because I don't want to just give somebody plot armor and never have him die. Now, mind you, having said that, the Dragon Tooth Labyrinth, our latest Age of Sigmar campaign, nobody could die, except there was one scenario where that was actually the consequence of losing, is that you had to roll for everybody who was destroyed and certain ones could die. And so So you can kind of do both. But the one thing that you don't want to do is have the story roll on without the battle reports having any effect. So the battles, not battle reports, the battles. So the few ways that you can do that is like what Miles suggested. I would say that rewards are fine as long as they're not major. Something as simple as nobody starts with a warlord trait if you're playing Warhammer 40k, and once a general has won or warlord has won 2 games, he gains a warlord trait. That kind of thing. Or you can bring an extra relic or an extra command point or 2, like little things like that. That it's not. I would highly recommend staying away from points. Like you get 200 more points than the other person because not that the game is balanced when you have points balanced, but it becomes a little more obvious that it's not balanced. But the biggest thing you can do, and also the most work, and this is where Miles has to do the most work, is after every battle, you look at what happened and you really try to write that into the story. And so what our typical narrative campaign, not all of them, will film it, and then I'll email Miles and give him a quick synopsis of what happened, like who won, did any significant deaths happen, and did anything super cool happen? And he'll take that and he'll continue the story and write that into the story. And that way it really feels like what's going on matters. Even if there's an overarching story that's going to happen anyways, kind of telling it from the point of view of those things that are happening. And you really got to watch out for those things too. I find that most of the time, the most interesting things that happen in the battles are not the things that were supposed to happen. Like a certain unit will just perform ridiculously well. So name that unit. Maybe throw an upgrade at them. Age of Sigmar was easy. You have your Path to Glory table. So you just like roll on the Path to Glory table because that one did really well. And now they have a 6-up ignoring wounds. Great. It's not game breaking, but it's a cool little thing. And we're going to call them this. That happens in the Dragontooth Labyrinth a couple times. And that becomes memorable. I've had some of my most memorable characters, like Commissar Khrushchev, become memorable because of happenstance. He wasn't a planned character. He was just a commissar that kept surviving against ridiculous odds. And so we gave him a name, and Steve kept changing the model every time because he kept dying but surviving. And so he's like, okay, we're going to remove his leg and replace it with a bionic leg. And now we'll cut off part of his face or repaint his face so it's like part bionic. He stood up to everything. And then he had an epic ending in the narrative campaign. It was awesome. And then the next narrative campaign, I brought him as a named character, and he died right away, or just basically didn't do anything right away. And so you just can't plan for that kind of stuff. So be willing to let whatever happens happen, and don't try to force cool things. You can force a story. Like if those Tyranids are going to arrive, no matter what they do, they're going to arrive. But how prepared are they for them when they arrive can make a big difference right there too.
Yeah, indeed.
I would say let's talk a bit about writing scenarios that paint you into a corner. Because I think when he's talking about that too, I think it's important that we discuss that. Because part of molding the story is molding the scenarios. So I'm going to let you talk about that for a couple minutes, Miles. First off, talk about the problem that we have sometimes faced. I know more so before you came on board because I had done it to myself several times. So I've learned from that by the time that you started working for us. But still talk about how maybe there's been some times where the battle has almost derailed your thoughts, and what you've learned from that, what you would have done differently, or how you turned that into a good thing.
Yeah, I mean, so I guess the main thing to keep in mind is don't design a scenario where there's no way out for one faction if they lose, unless it's the end of the campaign. Like, if it's the end of the campaign, sure. If one faction gets completely wiped out, so be it. That's how it ends. So always think of, like, what's their avenue of attack? How did they get here? And how can they get out if things go wrong? And especially with these kind of more character-focused narrative campaigns, that's something that we really need to think of every time, because it always comes down to, these characters can die, but that doesn't necessarily mean they die. That just means they might get injured. But how do they get out if it's a total loss? Like, what is going on there? And most of the time, it's usually, I guess the solutions are not super hard to come up with. Most of the time it's like examples with the Yogg-Viren and Tor campaign. There was, I think, one of the missions in the catacombs. Did they lose that? It was the first catacomb mission. They got attacked by the Night Haunts.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. And
he needed an object to advance the story.
Yeah, right. And they didn't get the object, which was a bit of a problem. But you know what? It's fine. We'll work with it. I had to change things in the story later to make sure that they got the information that they were going to have. But during that loss, they kind of needed a way out. Like if they were just in the catacombs fighting these Night Haunts, and they were taken down by the Night Haunts, well, there's no real logical way as to why they would live. I mean, Night Haunts aren't typically there to be taking prisoners. So what needed to happen? Well, the orcs that they were fighting before had chased them, or were raiding that particular catacomb for whatever reason. Doesn't really matter, but they show up as Yogver and Tor go down and kind of provide them the chaos to escape. And that's something that I guess you won't see it a lot because you don't have too many losses in the campaigns. I mean, they do happen, and maybe you'll see.
I think my experience is like you have to watch out for missions. Yeah, you have to ask yourself basically what happens if they lose as well. Yeah. It's like you have to give them an out, of course, make sure they're not backed into a corner. But you always have to have there's actually 3, and sometimes more than 3 potential outcomes of every battle. There's a win, there's a loss, and there's a draw. Mm-hmm. I did a campaign called the World Engine, and I made the mistake of having the first mission be planetfall. So basically, it's the Space Marines coming in, and they lost. I'm like, oh, now what? So let's do another planetfall. And that was, needless to say, that campaign didn't go on as long as I wanted it to. And then, so the Storms of Ixia, which was the next campaign, I had the planetfall happen in the narrative. And then they split off into 3 forces, and we only tracked the progress of the one force, so that if they lost horribly, we still had the other 2 forces to move the story along. But there would still be consequences. I didn't want them to think that it doesn't really matter what happens because I got these other 2 forces. It's like, oh, no, you didn't get the factory, therefore this. So there's still consequences, but you didn't ruin the story. And even in that one, I still remember, because I would actually, the way I wrote those campaigns was mission A. And then if player 1 wins, we're going to play this mission. If player 2 wins, we're going to play this mission. Yeah. And then I remember we actually played a mission where neither player won, that they annihilated each other down to 1 model. And I'm like, oh, well, that doesn't make sense to do either of my ideas. And so I had to come up with another idea. So you have to kind of think that. You have to be like, anybody should be able to win. Even if there's a games master, he should be able to win. Not that you're trying to win, but that you don't want them to think, well, he's the games master, he'll always make sure I win. He'll never give me a challenge that I can't beat. It's like, oh, that's not true. I want you to sometimes lose to feel that. But you have to ask your question. You have to ask yourself the question, what will happen if they win? That's usually the easy thing. But what will happen if they lose? And what will happen if it's kind of like, I kind of won, but I lost most of what was important in that victory. Like, Pyrrhic victory, basically. So always have those at least 3 outcomes in mind. And I think that you're pretty well taken care of. If you think, well, if they lose, they're done. They'd be like, well, then don't do that mission. That's a bad mission. Just stay away from it. Yeah.
I mean, unless you're okay with that, then.
Yeah. If that's your type of, if that's your cup of tea, where you're like, you know what, this is supposed to be a grind, and let's see if you can get to the end. And if you don't, well, we could try again. So that's an advantage.
It does make it a bit.
That's the advantage of not recording it, right? Like we make ours as video content for entertainment, so that can be a little less entertaining to be like, we got through 2 episodes and we're done. We'll start over. Oh no, we got through 3 episodes. Now we'll start over. Oh, we got through 2 episodes again. That can get a little repetitive.
Yeah,
but that could be fun.
Maybe not the most exciting thing to watch over and over again, unless it's done differently every time. I guess. And I don't know. I'm sure there's some ways to get around that, but not the ideal approach to campaign writing, I would say. But
exactly. Yeah. So talking about let's talk more about stories. I think we've covered a lot of what he's asked. So I have a few questions I'd like to, while we have Miles here, that we can use to kind of expand on this. So first off, so you've been writing for our narrative campaigns for a little while now. What would you say is the most challenging aspect of writing narrative campaigns for MiniWarGaming, or just in general?
It's I would say it is fitting in the story pieces, and keeping the word count at a reasonable level. It's yeah, that's I'm fairly wordy with my writing. Like I'll admit that I've gotten much better since I started professionally writing, but I tend to go into a lot of detail with things. Some might say too much detail. And that's perfectly fine. Condensing that into a cohesive introduction or a cohesive, story time in the middle of a session, for example. Some of the missions will have like a mid-mission story time that crops up, or most missions will also have some sort of ending story time. Trying to fit the information that I need to fit in for the purpose of advancing the story or the characters or whatever, that is quite challenging, especially when it comes to writing the first mission of the pair of missions that we always do, because it's always like we write these missions in pairs. So I have to make sure that no matter what happens in the first mission, the second mission will still work, right? And I think sometimes there have been instances where you've sort of taken that and been like, okay, we're going to extend the first mission into 2 missions, which
there's a little bit more, because sometimes we'll write a scenario and it'll be like, okay, this ended up taking a lot longer, so let's split it into 2 instead and just make that more interesting. So there's always that flexibility, right?
Yeah, exactly. And then at that point, need to hasten the story a little bit, but that's usually not a problem. Like most of the time when we map out these stories, I make sure there's at least like 2 or 3 potential filler missions that, at least in the outlining, like, okay, these aren't super important, so in case things happen, I can add stuff in during these missions or change them up along the way. And of course, these mission outlines are super up in the air, of course. I don't think I stuck with most of the outlines I made for myself. It's as a writer, that's kind of
what happens.
Yeah, it just happens. You make a super detailed outline, and I'm working on my own novel, and I didn't follow my outline at all. It's that presents its own problems, of course, but you also can use that to come up with solutions for yourself. Like, you obviously aren't going to think of everything when you're coming up with the outlines, so you don't need to plan an entire narrative campaign at the start. You're actually better off not planning an entire narrative campaign. You want a few core story ideas, like these are things that I want to have happen. How do I make them happen? But then you just go mission by mission, or 2 missions by 2 missions, however you have things arranged, and that way you can adjust the story, adjust how they get from point A to point B, and make sure that it happens. And that can be difficult.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, those are, like I was saying before, I've been doing a lot of narrative campaigns, and there's all these like common pitfalls that I found for myself. And the Wood already talked about one of them. That's writing yourself into a corner. But there's just it's finding a balance between just having fun games, adding in the story element to make them even more fun, having things be significant and actually matter, and just having everybody excited to begin with for whatever it is that you're trying to accomplish. And so I think that's all those elements have to come together. I think it would actually be very challenging for anybody to do a narrative campaign like what we do, just because I think it works so well for us because people are being paid to do it, so they have to show up. Barring sickness, it's like, we got to do it. We've got to finish this. They've got thousands, tens of thousands of people waiting to watch this video. And so we need to make sure that we deliver that. And so that, whereas with your friends, the moment something gets stale, it's just like, I don't know if I want to keep doing this. And what's your motivation? Yeah. And that can be a little harder. So, yeah. What was your out of all the narrative campaigns that you've written so far? What was your favorite to write?
Yogvir and Tor was a lot of fun. It was just, cool, great concept. I was honestly kind of worried about the lightheartedness. Like, I'm actually more of a horror writer, sci-fi horror stuff. Yeah, I do. The cosmic horror genre is sort of my thing. So when Matthew was like, "Here, I have this campaign. It's going to be much more lighthearted than the other stuff that we've done," and I'm like, "Okay."
You can tell us in the intro.
Yeah. But it turned out to actually be quite fun. And it got to sort of, exercise different muscles, so to speak, in writing that. And, I was still able to throw in a bit of doom and gloom and horror throughout it. But, and keep it a little bit lighthearted for the most part. And I thought it was a fun exercise, and I think it turned out pretty well. It was a lot of fun.
Yeah,
I watched every episode as well, and it was just cool to see how it all panned out. And some of the missions just not going the way you think they would, like the one with the it was like the 10th mission or something out in front of the gates where they had to kill the road idol, and they just did a beeline straight for it and destroyed it super fast.
That's right. It's like, oh, they're done. Look at that.
It's like, okay, that was actually pretty cool.
Or the Yogg-Viren floor moment. He jumped off the city walls, and I'm like, okay, you can jump, but you got to roll this and this and this. Oh, you failed, and it's just splat onto the ground. Yogg-Viren floor. So, no, I enjoyed that one a lot too. What is it? How does it feel to write and then see it actually come to life in the actual video form?
It's pretty awesome. Like, I love to see that. It's just cool to see the your work kind of put. I guess it would be similar, like if you write a script to a movie or something. Obviously, it's not quite as grandiose as that, but
of course,
it's it's still, it's really awesome to see it come to life. I guess that's basically what I get the most enjoyment out of, as far as writing these scenarios goes, is to see how they end up actually panning out.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. So stories received by the audience as well, which can also be tough, because sometimes they're more enthusiastic than other times.
Yep. That's definitely true. But, you learn from the times that they're not. Like, okay, what didn't they like? And how do we not do that in the future?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah. Well, I think we've answered this question, Cliff. We've gone through starting a story, setting up the goals, how to mold the narrative, talking about how to make everything matter, I think the major ideas for where you can get your stories from, how to get everybody excited. So, Miles, if people want to find you, where should they look for you?
They can email me, no problem. If they want any more information about narrative campaign writing tips in general, alternately, if you want to find
you, or to hire you as a writer,
to hire me, I'm of course always for hire. It's I'm a mercenary writer.
That's right. We'll make sure to post links to your Facebook and to your email in the description below, or wherever you happen to be watching this. For those that are just listening on the podcast, so do you want to share your email or Facebook?
Yeah, that's just Facebook, Miles Drake, I guess. It's what is my Facebook tag actually?
Well, I think it's facebook.com/the light that burns the sun as a page.
Yeah, that would be me. Yep. Email wise at gibbevex@gmail.com. But
naturally,
you can reach me that way.
Naturally.
Yep. Alternately, if you want to read any more of my stuff, I'm on the Black Library. I have one e-short, The Flesh Tithe, which is a lovely little horror story about a Necron Flayed One invasion on a unsuspecting shrine world. And then I have another slightly longer short story in the Inferno Volume 2, which is also dealing with that same conflict, which is actually set in the Ghoul Stars, featuring the Death Specters, who are pretty cool as Space Marines.
And that's official canon because it's in the Black Library.
Yep.
That's how that works, right? I'm assuming.
Yeah, I mean, I guess they do retcon things every now and then.
Oh, but, yeah, of course. Official canon until they don't want it to be official anymore. But that's right. Normal. That's normal for any long-standing universe.
Yeah.
Things have to change to fit marketing and whatever they're trying to accomplish at that time, too.
Indeed. I will say that they've gotten better about that recently, but
give them another 20 years. Maybe in 20 years you'll see some changes.
Yep.
Well, Miles, thank you very much for joining us today on this episode of the Wargaming Gamemaster. I know this episode's a little shorter than the ones we did, but we answered the questions, and I thought it would take longer to answer those questions, but it turns out that we're not as rambly as we thought we were. So I wasn't prepared for more than that.
This will be fun.
Exactly. So we'll definitely have another episode next week where we'll cover more topics all about narrative wargaming. So make sure you check that out everywhere where podcasts are available, or not here, I don't know where you're watching right now, on YouTube or on Facebook, wherever you like to follow our content. We'll be posting it all over there. So Miles, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure.
All right, and happy wargaming.
Happy wargaming.